Welcome, everybody, to another Center for Agricultural Profitability webinar from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Ryan Evans with the Center for Ag Profitability, and I want to thank you for joining us. As always, you can find a schedule of all of our upcoming webinars, as well as recordings of every past webinar on our center's website at cap.unl.edu. Today, we'll be taking a look at pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance options for livestock producers. And with coverage on over 8 million acres in Nebraska, PRF insurance has become a big part of doing business for many livestock producers across the state. The sign-up deadline for 2025 PRF insurance coverage is coming up on December 1st. So in this webinar, we'll discuss several PRF coverage strategies, some implications of those, as well as some historical performance of PRF using examples from Nebraska grids. An overview of PRF will also be discussed, as well as performance, so that producers can decide if and how they might want to incorporate the product into their own risk management plans. And to present, I'm glad to have with us Director of the Center for Agricultural Profitability and Professor of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Jay Parsons. So I will turn it over to Jay, and I also will encourage you, if you have questions, please do type those into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. So Jay?
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you to everybody attending today, and for those that are watching this, as we are recording it, and so it will be posted on our website. So if you happen to be one of those watching the recording, thanks for doing that too. So pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance is our topic today, and we'll just launch right into it. I have some national numbers, some state numbers, and some examples to show you. But as Ryan mentioned, please feel free to type some questions in as we go, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can here. And feel free to contact me too later if you have questions. So if you're not familiar with PRF, these first few slides are for you. If you are familiar, you might pick up one or two things that you forgot about. But this does fall under the umbrella of the USDA Risk Management Agency, and it's part of their rainfall index policies. And there are two different types of that. PRF is our subject matter today. Annual forage insurance program is also under that umbrella. And that's a policy, obviously, for annually planted forages. And the sign-up deadline for that is in the summer. So we usually do those webinars in the spring, and we do have some recordings of that up on our CAP website if you're interested in looking at them. And I want to also mention the RMA website, rma.usda.gov. So when I put stats up or examples up today, all of that is being pulled from their website, and it's stuff that you yourself can go look at because it's open for public consumption. But when it comes to these rainfall index products, of course, they're based off of a grid system, and that these grids are 0.25 degrees latitude by 0.25 degrees longitude, no matter where they're at on the map. If it's at if those happen to be at the equator, which the equator, of course, doesn't go through the U.S., but at the equator, it's a 17 by 17 square miles, roughly. Across Nebraska, it's most of these grids are roughly about 12 miles east to west and 16 miles north to south, and I'll show you some examples here in a moment. But they have historical data, rainfall data for these grids going all the way back to 1948, and they use that historical data to establish an expected rainfall, and then that becomes the 100% of normal that they base the insurance product off of. So it's pretty simple in that regards. It's all on percentages. So whatever that expected rainfall is matched up as the expected grid index, 100% of normal. You can insure with these with PRF and this rainfall insurance product anywhere up to 90% of expected rainfall, or as low as 70%. So if, for example, in this graphic here, if you had 75% coverage level, then that means if rainfall falls below that level over your insured period, then you would collect an indemnity. So in this example, the actual grid index turned out to be 44% of normal. So that's 31 percentage points, or 0.31. So that's the the number that they would use to determine your indemnity. That 0.31 would be multiplied by the coverage dollar value that you had in place, and then that would determine your indemnity. So the way it functions mathematically is very straightforward and very simple. And so that's nice on, right? Because it is an index and there are mysteries on how that is calculated. It doesn't measure actual production loss on your operation, though. This is a rainfall index. So when we talk about those grids, right, there's going to be weather stations that will determine the average rainfall for the entire grid. Okay, and sometimes those kind of where it's at in the country or in the state, there may be more than one weather station actually within the grid, and in some cases there may not be any weather stations in the grid, and they're using the nearest weather stations to that grid and do some triangulations and some calculations and estimations of it. But it's important to understand that that rainfall data is calculated by NOAA, not by RMA. So it is another independent party that's established the historical data for that, and of course the current data in the current year that would determine payouts for it. So that is separated out on there in terms of how that's done. Okay, so that's just the nuts and bolts of how that's calculated and the idea behind having an index policy. As far as PRF goes itself, it is for pasture, rangeland, forage. That's what the PRF stands for. It's also important to understand this is for perennial forage. I mentioned there is an annual forage product that's available for annually planted forages. The forage could be used for grazing or haying. The main thing there, you designate that if you intend to hay it. If it's something that you would normally hay, you can put coverage in place. The index itself works exactly the same no matter whether you're grazing or haying. That's if you go up to haying instead of grazing, I said up because what that does is increase the dollar value per acre that you could do in coverage. So you want to discuss that with your insurance agent and realize that, you know, perennial hay is insurable under this. Sign up deadline is December 1, hence the timing of our webinar here today, and that's for all counties throughout the 48 states. This isn't just for Nebraska, but all the counties in the continental U.S. Have coverage in them. They all have the same sign up deadline, and they all provide coverage on a calendar year basis. So by December, if you want coverage for 2025, that January through December would be where you'd be selecting the months to cover. You need to sign up for that by December 1 of this year, 2024, to get that coverage in place. The indexes themselves are based off of 2-month intervals. And so you could do that over the entire calendar year. You could provide coverage from 70 to 90% of normal rainfall and 5% increments. And again, this will become a little clearer as we go through some examples. You cannot overlap those. So for example, if you had July and August insured, you cannot insure August and September on the same policy because August would be double insured. There is what they call a productivity factor that the producer can adjust anywhere from 60% up to 150% of the county-based value. The county-based value is the average productive value of perennial forage in that county. So in pasture, there's if you're the Sandhills, you're probably looking around $20 an acre, somewhere in there. Panhandle, maybe more like $15 an acre or something like that. You get into eastern Nebraska, it would go north of 40 or $50 an acre in a lot of places. So there is a county-based value established, and then the producer can adjust that as low as 60% of that county-based value, or as much as 150%, or 1.5 times that value. And all that does is just change the dollar value of coverage. They give you that flexibility to do that. I generally don't recommend people go below 100% because that does not change your premium rates at all. It would change your premium cost, right? Because you'd be insuring a lower value. But it doesn't change your premium rate. So if there's other ways, if you're worried, if you want to save money, there's other ways to do that other than adjusting your productivity factor. It is fairly common though for people to adjust it up to 150%, especially in places like the Panhandle where they might have a lower dollar value per acre, and they just want to put more coverage on because of the risk that's involved with not getting rainfall and not having any forage at all in some of those cases. PRF is subsidized between 51 and 59%, depending on your coverage level. If your coverage at the highest level, 90%, you get the lowest subsidy, which would be 51%. And then you can see there as you go down to a lower coverage level, the subsidy goes up. We do see effects in the data of people taking advantage of that. No qualms on that, but in general, this is all designed to be actuarially sound. So it's not as big of a deal as you think it might be. And I'll show you that with some data. Okay, let's start with some data on a national basis, just so you can kind of get a feel how this is not just Ryan mentioned, it's become a way of doing business here in Nebraska, and I'll show you those numbers too. But it's become a way of doing business across much of the U.S. Especially in ranching country. So this is data on a national basis from 2018 to 2023, so a 6-year span, and this is 23 is pretty stable at this point. We know how all the losses came in. There might be a little tweaking here with some adjustments, late data that comes in, but these are pretty much complete at this point. But you can see on average, we had about 40,000 policies nationally, but you see the trend happening there, right? It's pretty much doubled over the 6-year span from about 30,000 policies to over 60,000 policies across the country. Heavy indemnity amounts there. Keep in mind that means that they got something back, and I'll show you, some examples. If you spread it out, odds are pretty good you'll get some indemnity back, maybe not enough to cover your premium, but so take that with a grain of salt. But overall, about 90% of these policies were indemnified over the 6-year span across the country. A lot of acres covered. I said policies have doubled. Acres have pretty much tripled across the country, up to about 290,000 acres in 2023. And then you see these really big numbers with lots of digits and commas in them, because this has actually become a pretty big chunk of insurance across the country in terms of the what's in place and how that works out on an annual basis. A couple of things just here is things to pay attention. They do work to make this actuarially sound, and that means they're comparing the indemnities to the total premiums. Okay, and you can see how that works out over time. And if you spread that across the country, it's actually more consistent than you might think, right? As you drill down in specific states, some states will have droughts and really high indemnities versus premium, and sometimes you have a wet year and really low indemnities versus premium. But if you spread it out across the country, it's a lot closer to actuarially sound, as we say, overall. And of course, if you spread that across years, that's what they're targeting, is to get that to match up. But when you see that indemnity payment, keep in mind that the producer doesn't pay all of the premiums that they're trying to match that with. And so when you have these subsidies involved, which is 51 to 59%, right, of the total premium, that's why we end up with the producers actually getting higher indemnities than they actually pay in premiums, right? So they're going to pay in the difference between these two numbers here, the total premiums minus the subsidies. And then this is the total paid out, 881 million, which represented about $2.24 paid out for every dollar collected over the 6-year span. Average acres per policy across the country is 4,700. You get a feel for it here. About $9,800 is the average premium, and about $22,000 is the average indemnity over the 6-year span across the country. On a per acre basis, it's about $2 in and $465 back out over that time span. You also notice how this, you spread it out. You can say, well, this is 2019 was a relatively wet year across the country relative to some other years. And of course, 2022 is relatively dry. And again, if you drill that down on the state level, you might see those numbers more pronounced. Some people like maps, and so I put this map together, help see people how this is spread across the country. Northern Plains, where we're at in Nebraska, is about a 2-to-1 payout over this time. About $3.36 an acre is the average premium over these 4 states over those 6 years, and about 12.9 million acres on average insured. Now, it's close to 3 times this amount right now, or double. I think it's about 25 million acres this last year that was insured there. So this is growing just like it is across the country. The mountain states by far has the most acres involved. Payout ratio is 2.33, but that's on par with the Pacific Coast and the Southern Plains and so on. But low dollar value per acre there, because of course you have a lot of extensive rangelands there with very low productivity. But you see across the country, pretty much everything's above 1, right? The closest was down here in Delta, 1.05. Not a lot of acres insured down there in that 3-state region. And of course, about $10 an acre, quite a bit more productivity insured. But even the Southeast, 2.31 payout, about $16 an acre there. So it's always interesting to kind of see how this goes. And if you spread it out over a number of years, these things tend to even out over time because, again, they're trying to make it actuarially sound and have the indemnities match up with the total premiums, and then everybody gets similar subsidies across the country. I get asked a lot about the level of coverage, and I just popped this in here on the national basis so you can see what's happening there. Again, most of the coverage is at the 90% level. And that's going to dominate the total down here on bottom. As you look at it in terms of the payout is going to producer loss ratio, and the loss ratio is going to be very close to what's happening at the 90% level. Some people, of course, drop down to 85% to get the increased subsidy there. It's not as big a deal as you might think, right? But 1.64 compared to 1.83, and you can see it's actually had a higher payout at the 80% level in the 2023 crop year. Again, if you spread this across time, you end up with these producer loss ratios looking very, very similar over time, with just that little percentage difference that we have with the subsidy over that. But this pattern, I'll show you the Nebraska numbers on this here after we do some examples. And we have a very similar pattern in here where you see people drop from the 90% down to 85% to get the extra subsidy. Very few people go down to 80% relative to that because they went down to capture that subsidy. But you see the other uptick here as people drop down to 75% to get that last little uptick in subsidy. And we have a similar pattern here in the state, but over there on the loss ratio column, you'll see numbers that look pretty darn close to each other. Okay, so let me show you a couple of examples, a couple of location examples. And we'll start in Dual County. Okay, so this is just north of Chapel, I believe. I believe that's where I put my dot there. I just typed in Chapel, so that give you an idea where you're at in the southeast quarter of the Panhandle, right after the interstate split if you're headed west. This grid number is 25311. And again, all of this, you could do this for yourself on the RMA website. If you go into their decision support tool, just type in your address and you can zoom in and find your actual pasture and put a pin down, and it'll tell you where you're at in the grid and so on. So I did this in Dual County, and I tell people if you're not sure what to do, I recommend what I call a base strategy, which is just spread it out over the year. So this is the example I'll put together to share with you today. So I just took all 12 months, January through December, and just went in 2-month chunks. So I had some coverage in every month and had it spread throughout the year. I did 20% in what might be termed the productive season, May through August there, and then 15% outside. So lots of different strategies people can use here, and I'll show you a couple of them, and I'm sure some of you have some questions on them. I did 90% coverage level, and I went ahead and did the 100% productivity factors. You can see that the base value in Dual County is $15.20 an acre. So with 90% coverage, my actual protection is $13.68 an acre. And since I did 90%, I get a 51% subsidy. So when I do this percentage on the coverage throughout the year, that just takes that $13.68 and spreads it out in these percentages in those specific intervals. So for the intervals I did 15% coverage, that's $2.05 an acre. And for the intervals that I did 20% coverage, that's $2.74 an acre. The premium rates are determined by that historical data. So that's their expectation that they would pay out. So they are generally more expensive to insure. Winter months where you generally get less precip, so it doesn't take much of a deficit to be at a pretty much of an actual deficit in terms of inches of rainfall or inches of precipitation. To actually be at a high percentage deficit. So the highest one here in terms of cost is November, December, because very high risk in terms of them insuring that, because it doesn't take much of a deficit to be below 90% of normal. So 26% is basically what they're going to charge on a premium for that. The spring and summer months where we get more rainfall, a little cheaper to insure. Matter of fact, on a dollar basis, it's half as expensive to insure. So that gets turned into a premium per acre. This is the total premium, which totals up to $2.58 an acre. And then the producer premium, of course, is just 49% of that. So that drops it down to $1.27 per acre. If I were to take out this policy for 2024, these are 2024 numbers. And then if you look at it historically, how that would have paid out, and this is for a 20-year span from 2003 to 2022. I can't remember why I cut off and did put 2023 in there, but we'll talk about that here in a second because I did it on another example that I have for you. But 2023 was actually lower indemnity, and that would have taken out this higher indemnity, so it actually drops down a little bit. But over a 20-year span here, that $1.27 premium produced an average indemnity of $1.67. So the producer loss ratio is 1.31. So about a 31% return on each dollar of premium paid in. And then about half of the time, 10 out of the 20 years I have here, this sample, the indemnity covered your entire premium. Okay, so you came out ahead, so to speak. But you do see the 2018 wet year here where you didn't get any indemnity, even though you had it spread out throughout the year. There was no indemnity in 2018 or 2015 in this particular grid with PRF. But most of the time you got something back. Yes, 90% of the time you got something back, and 50% of the time it covered your premium for you. So that's a base strategy in Dual County, just taking a look at it over that 20-year span. Some people look at what we call a growing season strategy, where they look at those growing season months, May, June, July, August, and just split the coverage among those. Of course, it's cheaper to do that because those were lower premium rates. All the other numbers over here in terms of your actual dollar value of coverage and so on is the same. So the math, works out very similar. It's just you're getting a cheaper premium and you're covering fewer months. So that $1.27, if you spread it out, is now only 90 cents an acre with this particular coverage. But of course, it's much less likely to cover your actual premium. But and you're more likely to have no indemnity if you look at the numbers here. So same 20-year span, 2003 through 2022, you see a lot more zeros in here. Okay, so a lot of the time, let's see, what do we have here? We have 6, 9, 11 of the years you get nothing back. Okay. But the producer loss ratio is actually higher with the spread out coverage or the base strategy that I had, where that was 1.31. So when you do get something back, like 2022, 2012, it's over $7 an acre. You got a lot coming back. You had a cheaper premium and so on. So actually, overall, it returns a higher percentage over these 20 years, but only 8 out of the 20 years does it cover your premium. And keep in mind that of those 12 years where it doesn't cover your premium, most of those are zeros in terms of the indemnity that comes back to you. So you could do this with the data. Your insurance person could walk through these. I don't know if 20 years is the right span to look at. I would definitely look at least 20, maybe 30 was a better number. But you can kind of see how it paid out and when it paid out and see years that you needed it. If you are a producer that is looking at PRF because of what happened in 2022 and you remember the drought of 2020 or 2012 as being similarly impactful on your operation, you might look at this and say, you know what, I think this coverage matches up better than if I just spread it out. That's up to you. That's your decision. But there's a lot of data out there that you can pull from and look at. So we do a lot of work, or I do a lot of programming out in the Sandhills at GSL. So I'll show you an example from Goodman's and Sandhills lab. If you go up there, it's actually our Goodman's and Sandhills lab, which is about 11,000 acres up in the Sandhills, just north of Whitman, and it'd be northwest of Mullen. But it actually spans into 3 different counties, but all 3 counties, Cherry, Grant, and Hooker, all have the same productive value. So I don't have to worry about that. I happen to put my dot where it is here, so I'll have a county come up, but it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that the grid is 26515. Okay, and for for that area, for those 3 counties, the actual base value is $22.60 an acre. So I did a very similar coverage, 90% coverage, 100% productivity factor. But that dollar value that is $20.34 an acre in terms of protection. This is that same base strategy where I spread it out throughout the year with either 15% or 20% on each 2-month interval. Because I am insuring a higher dollar value, I get more protection, anywhere either $3 or $4 an acre for the interval, depending on whether it's 15 or 20%. You can see the premium rates look very similar to what they were down in Duval County in terms of their expectations to actually pay out. About 13% premium rate in those productive months and 26% in this case for November, December. So that calculates out a total premium of $3.79 an acre. The producer portion of that, the 49% of that, would be $1.85 an acre. So more expensive, but more expensive because of the protection here in terms of dollar value per acre. How did that pay out? This one I did go to 2023, which actually did drop this producer loss ratio down quite a bit because we lost 2003 here. But it did pay out above the premium in 2023 also. That's not, nothing to sneeze at, but overall it was about 1.3 return here. So about 240 back in indemnity for $1.85 premium. In this case, 2018 didn't pay anything back either, similar to the Duval County example, but every other year did. But it only covered the premium actually 7 out of 20 years in there. Okay, so again, you could get these pulled up with your example for your grid and kind of see how it pays out, when it pays out, and match it up with what you perceive your risk management needs to be and how you'd like it to operate for you. This is the growing season strategy on that same grid, putting 50% coverage in May, June, and 50% in July, August. The premium, right, goes from $1.85 down to $1.34 because those are cheaper months to insure. But similar to what we saw in the Duval County example, right, we're going to see more zeros pop up. Okay, so it only covers the premium 6 out of 20 years, right? We see a zero now in 2023, for example, 2018, 2019, 2016, 2014, right? Lots of zeros popping up in here across the years where those growing season months were just fine. But again, 2012, $11.24, 22 is $4.46, and so on. So we see the dry years, in particular, that 2012 drought pay out, quite a bit. So historically, you'll see these things pop in. In this case, it's 1.24 is the producer loss ratio here on this particular grid over that 20-year span. Okay. And then one more example from up there, again, at that same grid, where I dropped the coverage level to 75%. So by dropping it to 75%, my subsidy level goes up to 59%. So I get more of a discount on the subsidy. But the trade-off of that is my protection goes down, which is one thing. But the big thing is that there's a bigger deductible here, right? So instead of rainfall needing to be below just 10% below normal before it'll pay me back, now it's got to be 25%, above 25% below normal to pay back. Okay, so the premium goes down to 91 cents because it's less likely. This one, because I dropped this coverage level down to 75%, this premium rate dropped. If you remember, May and June were up over 13% in terms of the premium rate, or $13 per hundred. Now we're down at $7, $8 range. Okay, because it's less likely that they'll have to pay back. So that coverage level drop does change this premium rate. If all I did was or if I kept this at 90% and just messed with the productivity factor, that would still leave the premium rates at the 90% level. That's what I was mentioning to you earlier in terms of the effect that those things have on them as you adjust it. So keep that in mind as you go through, but you're accepting a bigger deductible here in terms of deficits of rainfall. So that lower base coverage, the producer loss ratio is at 1.5, 91 cent premium, paid out $1.36 on average. Okay. Again, I went back to the strategy of spreading it out, right? So there's just 2018 is the only one that I get zeros, which is the same thing I had before at 90% coverage level. These dollar values are smaller than what we had before, but they're compared to that 91% premium. So they actually returned slightly better than the 1.3 we had before. It's at 1.36. Okay. And again, 8 out of 20 years, it covered the premium. The indemnity covered the premium. Okay. So I'll finish up with some summary data for the state as a whole. And this is 2013 when the rainfall index came into play in Nebraska. So I went back that far with this data. You can see that we trudged along for quite a while, right in that we had an uptick in 2013, and then we stuck right around 1,000 policies throughout the state for several years there from 2014 through 2020. Things dried out in 2020, pretty big payout on the producer loss ratio, 2.86 or $2.86 per dollar of premium collected. And then we started seeing some uptick. Obviously, it stayed dry, right? The policies themselves didn't change, but it stayed extremely dry. And people saw people getting indemnities from this and began to take out the protection. So we're all the way up to where we have about 5,700 policies in the state in 2024. We're covered in that 8 to 9 million acres across the state, 8.9 million in 2023 to be exact. And of course, this big jump, right, was partially attributed to that dry year in 2024, where our producer loss ratio was all the way up at 4.41. So basically, every dollar that went in, $4.44 went out from the producer perspective. So about 49.6 million in indemnities. You can see here, if you do the math here, only about 11 million in premiums out of the producer's pockets to produce that. So of course, that's going to increase interest. And we saw that effectively there, but over this time span, about a 2-to-1 payout, which is what we'd expect with that subsidy included, right? 51 to 59% subsidy, where they're paying a little over half of the premium for you. We'd expect it to be right around 2 on the producer level over a long period of time, over a large geographic area, and that's what we see here. I should mention that doesn't include 2024, and we've had a little bit more moisture this year, so we'll probably be a little bit below 1, maybe on the producer loss ratio. I don't know how that's going to work out. We still have a few months left, so we'll see how that works out in the long run. We're only about a little over halfway through the year in terms of the reporting stuff and what would be included in this data. If we look at just a 5-year average, 5 years from 2019 to 2023, we can see it's about $2.34 per dollar paid in, about 4.2 acres or million acres on average involved there. So we see a little bit more of that effect of these last few years here, where this is, like I've mentioned to people, really become a way of doing business in the state as far as ranching goes. To wrap up, if we look at the different coverage levels, this is for 2018 through 23, so a 6-year span, okay? And we see very similar to what we saw in the national data, where we had the most of the coverage is at the 90% level, okay? A majority of it is there. About 86% of those were indemnified over this 6-year span. 84% is the overall indemnity percent of policies indemnified over the 6-year span. So that's that 90% coverage level obviously is going to dominate the totals that we see at the bottom. About a 2-to-1 payout over this 6-year span, okay, which would dominate that there. But the interesting thing is you go down to the lower levels, just mirroring what we saw at the national level. There's some interest in dropping down to 85% from 90%. There's some interest in dropping down to 75% from 80% to get that higher subsidy level. But if we look over here on the right, it's not a big pronounced difference in terms of the producer loss ratio. Pretty much everything hovering right around 2 to 1. I don't put a lot of weight into things like this, the 1.92, because we're getting down to some pretty small numbers here in terms of how many policies were in effect at that particular coverage level. So quite often I see those types of things pop out. But it is a little interesting when you look at the producer activity per policy in case of the acres. So we can see that as they go from 90% to 85%, there's a significant bump up in the acres per policy. Similarly, when they go down to the 75%. So I would interpret that to mean that some people are covering the ones with larger acres. They drop down their percentage of rainfall coverage, kind of even out the costs there with that. Nothing wrong with that. It's all dollars at the end and based off of an index. So maybe not as much pronounced as you might think. It does increase your deductible and it does save you some money. Over the long period of time, though, it's going to perform very similarly in terms of the producer loss ratio. It's just there's going to be some years where you don't quite get the indemnity coming out because it might have ended up being 78% or something like that in terms of normal compared to normal rainfall. In terms of premiums, this is largely dictated by the acres, but premium per acre, of course, we see that trend happening as you go up to the higher level, you got to pay a higher premium. And then the producer indemnity per policy, again, that's largely dictated by the number of acres and total dollar values insured. So that's over those 6 years. Some people might say, well, what did 2023 look like? A little bit, it was a drier year, but not a super dry year, but similar thing happening. We did see just, as an outlier here, the 70% coverage level, a few policies are there at only 70% indemnified. Everything else is pretty consistently right in that mid 80% range in terms of indemnities. A little bit higher producer loss ratio at those lower levels, largely dictated by the lower premiums that they were paying in per acre. But similar pattern, just spread out. Go back to 2022 where it's super dry. A lot of that gets washed out, but we're in that $4 to $5 producer loss ratio, similar number, bump up at the 85, 75% level, and so on. So, we see these patterns exist over time. Maybe not as pronounced as some people might think, but most people plug in at that 90% level, which of course dominates the overall numbers that we see for the totals, pretty much no matter which year that you pick. Okay, so that's the data that I had to share with you today. It's a PRF information. I think, Ryan, we're ready for any questions that people may have.
I think, Jay, you did such a good job walking through this. Nobody has any questions quite yet, but we do want to give you the opportunity to chime in with a question. We're here to answer those. If you have one, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll wait a couple minutes to see if anybody has one that comes in. And while we're doing that, I just want to let you know when you close your Zoom window today as you leave, you will see a really short survey evaluation of this webinar that will give you an opportunity to let us know what you think of it, how helpful it was, and to give us any indication of topics on your mind or things you might want to see in a future webinar or programming.
While we're waiting for questions, just keep in mind, this is a part of the RMA crop insurance portfolio. So if you don't already have a crop insurance agent, you'll want to contact one of those if you're interested in purchasing it. If you already have a crop insurance person that you're working with for other policies, odds are pretty good they could sit down and help you get PRF in place too. And the sign up deadline is December 1 for the coverage for 2025 calendar year. So now is a great time to initiate that contact and start considering different policies that you might put in place and maybe play around a little bit and take some time to decide on what you actually want to have coverage in.
Great. And we did get a question here that asks you, Jay, after studying all of the numbers, if you personally took out a policy, what coverage level and protection factor would you choose?
That's a good question. So I don't know. I always tell people that this is a strategic decision, meaning you want to look through what you want for coverage and you want to stick with it over time. You don't want to bounce around. Okay. So from my perspective, I would probably take a look at, what kind of dollar value of protection do I want to have in place? And I bought the land that I actually own and I rent it out, so I wouldn't be doing PRF, but land I own is in the Southern Panhandle. So you're talking pretty low dollar value per acre that you could insure there. So I would probably bump up the dollar value per acre using the 150% productivity factor. I'd probably cover all of my acres. I'd probably spread it out over the year, the base strategy that I had there, because I'm one of those people that hates to have an answer of of nothing. I'd hate to have the whole year come back that I'm just paying into it. Yeah, and so I'd probably use that base strategy over time and just stick with it over time and know that each year I'm likely to get something back. Some years are going to come out well ahead, some years slightly ahead, but over time I'll capture that subsidy coming back in. So good question.
Great. We did get one more question here I'll get to. I just also put in the chat here, people might be interested in. There's a series of meetings that we'll be doing across the state, I think at 6 different sites across the state on just livestock risk management, where we'll be covering PRF as well as the LRP, and then the new weaned calf risk protection program. If that's of interest to people, there's a link in the chat there. There are a couple dates out west after December 1st. So again, the PRF sign-up deadline is December 1st, so keep that in mind. But you might want to look at that if you're interested in other insurance options and risk management. So Jay, next question was, can you look at the payout on different bi-monthly intervals? Are there some intervals that pay out better than others?
That's a good question. So keep in mind that's largely dictated by those premium rates. So when you look at these examples right here, so this premium rate, again, this is at the 75% coverage level, so that discounted those, right? But if you look at it across the different intervals, okay, basically that means over time they expect to pay out basically 20% on it, okay, over time. So they're going to charge you that, right, to cover those losses. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to pay out little bits frequently or a lot once in a while, okay? And so you could go and take a look at those data that they have, because they have all the precipitation data in the where I was pulling this data from, and kind of see how that pattern exists. But during the winter months, it's such a low percentage that a lot of times when it's below, it'll be percentage well below normal. So it'll pay out a lot, but maybe less frequently on it. But each area and each 2-month interval may be different across the state and where you are and how you get your precip and so on. But I hesitate to get too carried away with trying to outguess Mother Nature, which is what that feels like a lot. I tend to just look at the numbers and say, if I stick with this over 10 years, this looks like this is something that's going to pay out fairly regular. If I do it this way, it's going to pay out less frequently, but higher amounts. And I've looked at enough of these examples that if you spread it out over a big enough area in terms of the grids that you're working with or the years that you're working with, in the end, the returns look the same, right? It's just a matter of whether it comes out frequently at low amounts or infrequently at high amounts, but it averages out very close.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions right now, so last call if you want to get that in. Oh, that worked. So this is in reply here, Jay, to the first question about what you would choose if selecting coverage here. You said great answer, but I think the only thing you didn't say, or I didn't hear, is coverage level. So is that 85%, 90%? And are you familiar with how the recent higher loss ratios are affecting insurance companies under standard reinsurance agreement?
No, I'm not familiar with that detail as it goes through, so I'd be curious to hear about that. Yeah, I did say 90%, I think it is what I would do on that at that point. And I'll be completely honest, I haven't messed a lot with the coverage levels in terms of different examples. I've pretty much messed with just whether you focus on fewer number of coverage intervals versus spreading it out. And then looked at different patterns across the state in different areas. So yeah, so I'm not familiar with that. I'm not surprised that some of that does things pay out and so on. I do notice patterns at the lower levels that it's not all that frequent that I could tell, and this is just my guess. That the 75 versus 95, for example, is that big of a difference on whether you get paid out. But maybe I'm wrong on that, because I don't see a lot of them where it hits in that mid range between 70 and 90%. And that's the determining factor. So I don't know if that's what their question was driven by, which direction they were looking at it in terms of premium rates or not. But
All right, thank you. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Don't forget, this recording will be posted in the next 24 hours on our Center for Ag Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu. We'll be back next Thursday at this time at noon Central with a webinar on the farm income picture in Nebraska and the US, updating on projections for 2024 as well as outlook for the future. So you can find that on our website as well at cap.unl.edu if you want to register. And thank you to Dr. Jay Parsons for the presentation today. And thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions that come to mind, please don't hesitate to reach out to Jay or anyone here at the Center for Ag Profitability, and we are happy to help. So thanks again, Jay, and everybody have a great afternoon.
thank you, Ryan.